Hi, everyone. Welcome to our new episode. Today we have with us Dr. Algee-Hewitt, and he is an associate professor of English at Stanford University. He's also director of the Stanford Literary Lab, where he brings quantitative analysis, digital humanities, and 18th century literature together. His research focuses on literature of the 18th and early 19th centuries, especially the history of aesthetic theory and the development and transmission of aesthetic and philosophic concepts during the Enlightenment and Romantic periods. So, from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in kind of a range of topics across the 18th and 19th centuries, but especially the role of aesthetic theory during the Enlightenment and the role of digital humanities in literary study. So I know a lot of graduate students find it difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what or who resonates with you? And what led you to your own research?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's a difficult uh, process to try and figure out what it is that you really want to focus on. I talk to undergraduates or I talk to graduate students or really just people who are interested in sort of diving deeply into a topic. The thing I always find myself reminding them is that this is something you've got to be able to live with for a while, right? Whether you're spending a year researching a master's thesis, whether you're spending 5 years thinking about this as a PhD, or gosh, for some of us, 10 years thinking about a book, this has to be a topic that's rich enough, but also that you feel passionate enough about to actually spend that amount of time with. And that's a tricky thing, or it can be a tricky thing. And the way that I think about it is that I'm really interested in the question of why, right? So if I start with something that I am really interested in or really passionate about, I'll ask myself, okay, what is it about that thing that makes me really, really jive with it? Right. So when I was an undergraduate and I read, for example, Keats's Odes, which I absolutely loved, but the Romantic period wasn't my first area. I actually thought I was going to be a 20th century postmodernist. Um, but I sort of came into the back door theoretically to that. But it was when I read Keats's Odes that those suddenly spoke to me. They resonated with me. The same with Blake's late Prophecies, another Romantic period writer. And in both of those, I realized that what really interested me was that the meaning of those pieces was conveyed not just by what the author was saying, right? Not just the ideas that were being expressed in the words, but how they were saying it. And it's sort of a strong form of that old McLuhanist, the medium is the message. But in the case of literature, it's almost stronger than that. The medium is definitely the message, right? Like whether it is a printed object, whether it's an engraved object, whether it's an oral object, that all is really important. But the aesthetics are the message as well, right? Like how something is written is equally important to what it's trying to say or what it's trying to mean as the words on the page itself. Not that those two things are really completely separable. Um, and that really was my entrance into what I do. It's a much longer circuitous route if you actually trace it through a master's degree in German philosophy and theory to an English PhD at New York University, where I was thought I was going to do something very straightforward with 18th century aesthetics that turned out to be entirely impossible until I started to think about how I might be able to do it quantitatively rather than through traditional methods. But all of it is really driven by that kind of insight from me, which seems really trite looking back over 25 or 30 years, but at the time was like so earth shattering that meaning resided in the form, in the style, as much as it did in like the actual words on the page.
Definitely. So almost the container is as important as the content in a way.
Absolutely, or really, I think what I've come around to, and a lot of the work that I'm doing at the Literary Lab now is sort of dancing around this idea that the container and the content actually aren't really separable. You can't take them apart and change them around without really deforming the whole thing.
Definitely. So I would also love to speak a bit about the role of digital humanities and quantitative analysis in your research. Can you please tell us, for those who don't know, a little bit about what exactly quantitative analysis is as it relates to literary research in particular, and what your own process is like when you use it to explore the fields of literature and digital humanities?
Yeah, of course. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I should situate it a little bit in that the digital humanities, sort of broadly conceived, is this big tent, as they're fond of saying in the business, that incorporates a lot of different methodologies and approaches to humanities knowledge. It really is anything that involves the use of computation or digitization in some way towards humanities ends or humanities methods towards understanding the computational or the digital. But quantitative analysis lives in a little corner of it. And the way I think about it is that we use quantitative methods, that is, we count things at a very base level, although we count them in increasingly sophisticated ways, in order to answer questions of humanity's significance. And for the literary lab, that's really the important part, right? Because we always start, and at least in my work, I always start with the question first. There's something I want to know about, usually about literature, although I have questions that go even broader than that. But usually something literary or very humanities based that I want to know about. But they're the kinds of questions that can only be asked using computational or quantitative methods. And it's really important to recognize that there are certain things that computers are really good at and certain things that they're really not good at. And if you can phrase a question in such a way that it becomes something that the computer's good at, then you can really do some interesting work applying quantitative analysis to these humanistic questions. But that it's really predicated on being able to formulate the question and formulate the approach in a way that speaks to the strengths of both the computer, but also the critic as well, right? There's a lot of human intervention in this process that still remains absolutely necessary. So I see it very much as a kind of hybrid method that combines both.
Definitely. Thank you for that. So, in your 2017 article, just kind of tying all these topics in, you have a brilliant quote from this article. So, it's entitled Distributed Character Quantitative Models of the English Stage, 1550 to 1900. It's published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And you write, quote, the kinds of abstractions offered by quantitative analysis operates across scales and ways foreign to literary study. Measurements of the frequency of a single word in a single text or in thousands of texts operate at extremes of scale. These analyses demand new kinds of abstraction, ones that can take into account minute effects in single text replicated across a corpus at large, establishing metrics, finding patterns, and linking these metrics and patterns with meaningful concepts of literary criticism. These are tasks that digital humanities now faces. In doing so, it must ask new questions about the nature of what it studies and how computational results are compatible with the established practices of literary criticism. So I think you put this so brilliantly, and I would love to hear a bit more, kind of in your own words as well, about your thoughts within this quote. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the question of scale in literary study, and the ways in which digital humanities kinds of can open up these doors?
Yeah, of course. I think about scale, and I think this quote was really me trying to get at this along a whole continuum. It's not so much when the field first started. I should back up a second. When the field first started, we made a lot of noise about large scale analysis, right? Like, whereas literary study in particular, but humanities broadly, was confined to, the single text. And even the single text is big. Like when you're dealing with a novel, it's a lot of material. And so an article or even a book that deals with a novel like, I don't know, Charles Dickens' Bleak House, has to abstract, cut down, focus really on very specific parts of it in order to get at these kinds of questions through traditional critical methods. And so the promise of the digital humanities, or quantitative analysis very particular, like computational literary studies, was that we were going to be able to look not just one book, but at a corpus of books, hundreds of books, thousands, millions, et cetera. And we've done that. And that's important. But to me, what's really important equally to remember is that the computational operates across the whole range of scales in a way that traditional criticism doesn't. So, one of the basic methods in my field is called stylometry. And that's where you try and use a computational method to do what's called authorship attribution. I mean, it's got broader uses than authorship attribution. I should be clear, but that's sort of like the ground zero use case for it. And so you've got a text that you don't know who it's by. You've got some probable people that you think it might be by, and so you get a representative sample of each of their texts. And you break the text apart and look at how the words are put together, with the idea that you want to see which of that reference corpus, your unknown text, is the most statistically similar to. And whenever I teach a class on quantitative analysis in literature, I do this fairly near the start because there's this really bizarre moment when the students realize that you can use the 150 most common words in the English language. And we're not talking like complicated words. We're talking the, and, it, or, at, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like those kinds of words to really cleanly and really easily associate texts with particular authors, with particular genres, with particular periods. The whole concept of authorship is a little troubled, and I won't go down that rabbit hole here. But you can do a lot of work with these really tiny, simple words. But if you took a scholar of, I don't know, say for example, Jane Austen, who's been working on Jane Austen for 40 plus years, knows everything about Pride and Prejudice, and you said, okay, how many times does the word the occur in Pride and Prejudice? That's that's not a question they can answer, right? That's not a question that makes sense in any kind of literary studies. But it's a really, really easy thing to do computationally. And the deal is that when you do that really easy thing a bunch of times, those patterns emerge, and then you start seeing things that you're not able to see otherwise. And then at that point, you can replicate up across giant scales. And this is true from like really simple methods that involve counting words, that, for example, stylometry would be, all the way up to using like large language models like BERT or even contemporary AI engines. The whole goal across all of those kinds of interventions is to operate across these scales, to use the computers to see these very, very minute things, and to see how those are replicated in patterns that are invisible to the reader across a huge swath of text. I mean, if that's the kind of question you're asking, right? And you don't have to go across the whole spectrum. You can say, okay, how does this operate at the scale of a single novel or a single poem? Or you could say, there's this critical thing that we've recognized. How does that operate across, hundreds of thousands of texts? But keeping in mind that it's both ends of this scale, right? That really let us ask different kinds of things than we would be able to through traditional methods of criticism, like close reading, like sociological analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying those aren't still important. In fact, most of how I think about what we do computationally is to find new patterns, new material, new objects that then we can bring back to those kinds of literary analysis and say, okay, how do we understand this complicated, very intricate, nuanced pattern, sociologically, using the kinds of tools that we've developed over the past 100 years? And that's to get at the other end of the quote that you gave. That's kind of what I mean about compatibility, because computational analysis operates one way, and literary analysis operates in a slightly different way, and figuring out where the places where those two kinds of analysis. These two methodologies can actually speak to each other, can interface with each other, and ideally mutually inform each other in a kind of iterative process where one teaches you about the other. That's really the space where like the magic can happen in this field.
Thank you for that. Definitely. Can you give us an example potentially of such a pattern that's cropped up maybe recently, maybe one that surprised you? What
Yeah,
kinds of patterns
absolutely.
are you noticing?
Well, these patterns happen at all sorts of different scales, and I'll give you two examples because I think they kind of illustrate. So at the very very little scale, I was doing a project not too long ago, looking at abstract and sort of concrete nouns in poetry in the 18th and early 19th century. And I was really interested to see how authors were deploying these very like heady concepts like justice or humanity versus like very specific like chair and shirt and rock, etc. And so I worked out a way to detect whether or not a word was towards this abstract idea or whether it was towards this kind of more concrete way, building on some earlier work that colleagues had done in the literary lab earlier. Um, and I sort of tracked all of those words across poems from about 1700 to about 1850. And I was really interested to see like how those words, the use of those words changed. And what I discovered was actually kind of fascinating, at least I found it fascinating, which was as you move forward in time, what happens is those words become less, call it clumpy. In other words, what would happen in the early to mid 18th century in a poem is that you would get a lot of kind of very concrete words, very specific nouns. And then after that sort of cluster, you'd get one or two very big, very conceptual, abstract nouns. And as you move forward to the early 19th century, those become much more integrated. In fact, what you'd frequently get is like a very abstract noun, then a little sprinkling of kind of concrete ones, and then some more abstract ones. And thinking it through, what I wound up theorizing this meant, and this appeared in an article a few years ago, um, was that there's actually a kind of infiltration of the scientific method, or at least the ethos of the scientific method, into poetic practice, right? So in the 18th century, where the idea is that we study the scientific method by induction, which is you find a number of sort of concrete examples of things, and then you put them all together and you say, okay, what kind of general rule can I establish based on all these individual examples, right? That's like having a bunch of really concrete nouns, which end with this kind of big, sort of abstract conceptual thinking. So, like Thompson in his poem Winter, the poet James Thompson in a mid 18th century super famous poem named Winter, really popular at the time, he'll give you a bunch of really concrete examples of like things in winter and the ways that winter challenges us to deal with it. And then after he gives us all those very specific examples, he backs up and is like, well, and that teaches us something about the nature of the seasons and the way that God, or the way that we should understand our devotion to God through our behavior in the seasons. Versus you get up to the Romantic period and they're doing actually the opposite. They'll start with this big, heady idea and then they'll break it down into concrete examples. And so, like Shelley in Mont Blanc starts with the everlasting universe of things rolls through the mind, right? Like you start with everything, the everlasting universe of things. And then he breaks it down into very specific, concrete examples. And that change, I think, echoes this kind of background socio-scientific cultural change in the epistemology of how knowledge is produced. So that's one example at the very, very minute. At the moment, we're working on a project on domestic space in the 19th century. So we're really interested to see, A, if we can teach a computer to recognize when a passage from a novel is set in a domestic space or not. But then B, like once we can do that with some reliability, what if we classified all of the passages in all of the novels we had? And we have about I think 3,000 or so 19th century novels. What if we took all of those novels and classified all the passages? Could we establish some kind of different history of domesticity? And so we spent a long time annotating six-sentence passages from novels as to whether or not they occurred in a domestic space or not. And we had a bunch of rules. And the rules, I won't bore you with the whole set, but one really specific example that was a bit controversial among our group was that if something was outside, and as specifically outside the home, we'd classify it as not domestic space. And so we used all of these examples to train a large language model, a BERT-based sentence encoding model, to recognize domestic space. And we did this with a bunch of passages, and we looked at the results when they came back, and it performed really, really well. That is, it mostly agreed with our annotators, except it classified a bunch of gardens and a bunch of carriages as domestic spaces. And we thought, oh, well, what's going on here? Is this a problem with the training data, et cetera? But when we actually dug into it and looked at it, we realized that the kinds of conversations that characters were having in gardens and were having in carriages were much more like the conversations they were having in bedrooms and drawing rooms and parlors than the kinds of conversations they were having in public parks or city streets or offices, et cetera. And so we started with these very, very specific examples from human annotators, but by passing it through this kind of computational process, it revealed a pattern that showed us that domesticity was lurking in these really, really unexpected spaces.
Thank you so much for those brilliant examples. That's absolutely incredible that a machine learning model can do that and can kind of use text in that way to uncover these kinds of things. That's insane, actually. Amazing. How interesting. I kind of, it does kind of make sense, I guess, when you look at gardens and carriages. I guess they're kind of enclosed spaces, or kind of more enclosed, more private than like an office or a
Exactly.
street. So it does kind of make sense as well. That's really, really fascinating as well. Yeah. Wow. Insane. Um, so I would also love to ask you a bit about um, the kind of time period that we're discussing, and also the role of aesthetic theory within that time period. So for anyone who doesn't know, can you kind of set the stage for us about what exactly was happening in the 18th and early 19th centuries, kind of socially, politically, economically? We've touched a bit on it, but what kinds of factors were influencing the types of literature coming out of this period?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really, really big question. And I could teach,
Definitely.
a whole year course on exactly this topic. So I'll try and be brief, but we're talking roughly the period between, my dissertation was entitled, or the subtitle of my dissertation was A New History of Aesthetics, 1660 to 1860. It's my two-century, 18th century. But that's the period roughly that I'm thinking about, right? And I'm thinking about it mostly from an Anglophone perspective, but keeping an eye on broader European, but also broader worldwide developments. And the way I like to think about it is that we think of this period, which is sometimes called the Enlightenment, sometimes called the Augustan Age, sometimes called other various things. And we frequently think of it as a period where a lot of new stuff is happening. And I think that's true. But what I like to think of it at the broadest possible scale is that it's not so much that a bunch of new things are being invented, although that is somewhat true. But it's more that those things that had been invented, these big social, political, scientific, and literary changes, are now happening on bigger and bigger scales, which is fundamentally altering the effect that they have on society at large. right? So, starting from 1660, you had in England, you've got the Restoration. After England's brief experiment with a republic, the Commonwealth, the King Charles II is restored, but restored in a way that the constitutional monarchy enacts a kind of check on the king's power. So you have this kind of movement towards not necessarily a democratic, but a more open culture. At the same time, you get the foundation of the Royal Society in the late 17th century, so in the late 1600s, which is introducing all sorts of new experimental methods into the discourse of science. Um, Again, the printing press invented well before this period in the 18th century, but it's only in the 18th century that you get the scaling up of printing houses, right? Of book publishers and something that looks a little bit more like the contemporary book marketplace. And so all of a sudden, printed books become something that's not just for the very, very wealthy, but instead circulate much more freely among a broader populace, among whom the middle class has emerged, the mercantile class. Especially as the power of the aristocracy is being reduced, so you have all sorts of new readers, and the wealthy mercantile families can actually afford to buy books and create their own home libraries for those who can't. The advent of circulating libraries and lending libraries make these available to the masses. Um, and finally, at the same time, you've got this broader circulation of ideas around Europe, particularly between France, Germany, England, and the other countries of the continent, as well as a much broader expansion into a global world with all of the good things. That is a broader understanding of the place of Europe within a broader world, and the bad things. This is when colonialism really scaled up. This is sort of the high point in the 18th century of the slave trade. So you've got like sort of the very, very negative consequences of it, but also from an intellectual perspective, this new circulation of ideas. So it's a time when a lot of things are rapidly changing and are rapidly in flux. And then by the end of the century, you get the kind of payoff of a lot of that with events like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Regency in England, and the sort of political instability that causes, which all leads to this kind of advent of industrialization, which is beginning to ramp up in the 18th century, but is only really taken off in the 19th century. So it's this time of tremendous change where really positive things and very, very negative things are all happening. And so it's an exciting period to study. And for aesthetics in particular, I think there's two things that to me make this particularly interesting. The first, as I said, is this kind of scaling up of printing, that all of a sudden literature becomes something that's not just accessible by the very, very wealthy, but becomes much more democratic, much more popular. Like popular literature becomes, I would argue, and this is a little contentious, popular literature becomes a thing in the 18th century in the kind of form that we understand it today. Now, there were definitely popular forms of entertainment before, the theater, the opera, etc. So I'm not suggesting that things weren't popular before, but the idea that you could have a book that could become the equivalent of a bestseller, right? This becomes a thing in the 18th and early 19th century. There's a great story. Lord Byron, poet of the Romantic period, famous for kind of being famous and like his exploits, but also well known for his writing, was so famous by the time he began his last really big work, which was called Don Juan, this big satirical poem, that when he was advertising for it, he and his publisher in the London Times, in the advertisement section, took out a single advertisement in the Sunday Times in the middle of the page, and all it said was Don Juan coming soon. And that's it. It didn't give any details or anything. And it created this like frenzy of excitement because like rumors had spread and people know, oh, that's Byron's latest thing. So you get this kind of like advent of like incredible popularity. That's just really like the apotheosis of this kind of spread of literature. Now, the other thing that really interests me And this again goes to this idea that the 18th century is not when a lot of things are like invented, but when they become like much more relevant at scale. Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, the scientist, publishes the Principia Mathematica back in the 1700s. And it's got this foundational effect, like this seismic shakeup of how we understand science and the scientific method. But he says something in the preface really, really important. And that is, and I don't remember the Latin off the top of my head. That's among among my academic strengths. That's not one of them. But it's something like the equivalent of like this book is about physics and it's about the planet and the motion of the planets and gravity, etc. But you know, I believe that if we had the right formula and the right way to measure anything, then we could establish along similar lines as I have done here scientific formula, a mathematical formula for understanding anything in the world. And this seizes the popular imagination, right? So it's not just like the motions of the heavens. It's not just like what a rock does when you throw it. If we could measure anything, we could work out mathematical formulas for it, and then we could predict stuff. And this becomes like a huge thing. And people are trying to do this with chemistry. They're trying to do it with biology. Like, what can we measure? How do we apply math to it? And people are doing this with art. They're doing it with literature and they're doing it with aesthetics. And this is where the science of aesthetics comes in, right? It's like this naive, very early attempt to measure things, to measure the beautiful, to measure the sublime, to measure the picturesque, and to come up with rules and laws that will let us predict this is beautiful, this is not beautiful, this is sublime, this is not sublime, this is whatever, this is not whatever. This will be appealing, this will not be appealing. And you get this whole advent of like the science of taste, et cetera. Like, in fact, there's an aesthetic theorist from the early-ish 18th centuries, writing in the 1720s, called Francis Hutchinson. And he comes up with this theory in this book. And it didn't like take off for obvious reasons, but it's a great example of exactly what I'm talking about. He says that beauty is maximum variability within maximum uniformity. And you're like, what is that? Like maximum variability, maximum uniformity. Well, he goes on to give you an example. And he says, okay, well, a triangle is less beautiful than a square. An equilateral triangle is less beautiful than a square because a triangle has three parts that are all equal size, but a square has four parts that are all equal size, right? More variation within this uniformity. And then a pentagon is more beautiful than a square. And an octagon is more beautiful than a pentagon because you keep increasing size. And eventually you get to like spheres are the most perfect things. But it's this like rigorous mathematical thing that when you step back makes no sense whatsoever. But like, is this authentic attempt to apply scientific rules to this like science of beauty?
That is a beautiful summary of what's happening during the period. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it seems that this period has a lot of change, but equally a kind of a period of concepts that have remained prevalent today. So it's almost like a period of change and then stagnation, or for lack of a better word, a period of change and then concepts arising that have stayed, let's say, for many, many years to come,
Yeah.
particularly within science and art. And I suppose when you were talking about aesthetic theory being a kind of spotlight on a container of a work of art, as well as the content, I suppose this relates very heavily to what you were discussing about this period of concepts coming out of the woodwork and arising during this period of change. So you start thinking, what is beautiful? What is sublime? What is art? What is one kind of art versus another? What is one kind of, science versus another? And I suppose containers then become even more important because formatting and categorization starts becoming more uniform in a way, especially with the novel being more popular and coffee house culture being more popular.
Mhm.
The novel kind of coming into common conversation rather than just this, pure and purely intellectual sphere. The container of art, I suppose, starts being a very hot topic for people.
Mhm.
Would you
Yeah,
say?
very. very much so. And I'm so glad you phrased it like that because I think there's something really, really important there because it's not like people weren't talking about the beautiful or the aesthetic for like the previous 3,000 years. Right,
Right.
you could go back to like Aristotle's Poetics. I mean, 2,500 years, I guess. You could go back to like, I mean, the first treatise on the Sublime, which is the concept that I've spent a lot of time working and thinking about, is by Longinus, and that comes from like late antiquity. But the big change is when you look at, so when people are writing about this prior to the 18th century, largely, not exclusively, but largely, what they're writing are rhetorical manuals, right? So what they're saying is, in order to make your speech as appealing as possible to the masses, here's what you should do in order to persuade them, right? So it's like a how-to guide. The 18th century discourse of aesthetics flips that around, right? So it's not about like, if you want to go write a poem, here's how to make it beautiful. It's let's think about the fundamental laws of what make things beautiful, right? Can we establish that empirically such that we can take a given poem and we could say, okay, how does this work? What are the factors of it that make it beautiful, sublime, picturesque? I would even say there is, and this is one of my more probably controversial opinions, um, but I would say that if we're looking for the foundations of contemporary literary study, but like art study in general, you could do worse than to look at the essays that Joseph Addison wrote in his magazine, The Spectator, on Milton's Paradise Lost. And he did this in the early 1700s, the early 18th century. And the reason I would say that is two things. One, The Spectator was an incredibly popular magazine with a really wide circulation. And so, for the first time in this kind of casual, and it was read, you're absolutely right, in coffee houses, like just casually. For the first time, you get this series of articles that's really taking apart a poem and being like, why does this work? Written for a much broader audience than like people who are sitting thinking about rhetorical theory. At the same time, the way that he does it is not just to pay attention to the rhetoric, not just to pay attention to the content, but to say, okay, how does one influence the other, right? Like, why does Milton's attempt to talk about the war in heaven really resonate? Because of the particular words he chose and the particular style in which he chose to arrange them on the page. So these two features, I would say, really are the genesis. And it did a lot of development since then. So there's a number of other important moments that you could peg. But I think that is, for me at least, like the kernel of where this whole field came from.
Definitely, I totally agree. And I would also love to turn to another article that you have,
Hmm.
kind of relating to our current conversation as well, entitled "Acts of Aesthetics: Publishing as Recursive Agency in the Long 18th Century." In this article, you use, quote, quantitative analysis of texts to identify the lexical patterns that may reveal the ways in which authors of the period envisioned the work of aesthetics.
Mhm.
So, can you please tell us a bit more about what the research process was like for this project? What were some of your most surprising conclusions? And how was that overall process for you, kind of merging the fields of aestheticism, the long 18th century, and the analysis and computational methods that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, of course. That's an oldie but a goodie. And in fact, it is a kind of splinter project of a much larger one that forms the basis of a lot of the graduate work that I did, but also the book that I've been working on for entirely too long now that will hopefully be out in the very near future, which largely looks at um, these kinds of patterns of aesthetic concepts, sort of trace how they inflect through different authors, but broadly how they move through history. And this actually goes back to something I said very early in our conversation, which is that this is the kind of thing I wanted to do really early on, like purely critically, that I discovered needed to be done, for me at least, computationally. And so it's a really good example of what I think you just asked about. Um, And so I guess like the actual story would help, right? So I wanted to write a dissertation on a very specific topic, the sublime itself. I was really fascinated by this idea that here's this word that stands in for something that can't be described, and that kind of tension between indescribability, but also we have a vocabulary for indescribability. We can't describe the thing, but we can describe our inability to describe it, and that always fascinated me. And but there's a lot that has been written, like a lot that's been written on the sublime, but it follows a very specific pattern, right? Like you take the big theorists, you take Immanuel Kant, you take Burke, and then you'll take a couple of other like slightly more minor figures, like maybe Humphrey Repton, Geoffrey Payne Knight, maybe Denis, maybe Barry Wollstonecraft, all of whom wrote something about the sublime, and you'll sort of dig into their ideas. And my thought was like, what fascinates me, and you'll see a pattern here quickly emerging, is that like this is a really complicated concept, but like it's everywhere. Everyone's using it, everyone's talking about it. And I want to know about like its cultural penetration. I don't want to know necessarily what Kant is saying about it. I want to know like when it shows up randomly in a poem or in a book, like why are people using that word? How did that happen? And that transformed into a slightly different question, which is like, what happens to it? Because it's really, really popular in the 18th century. And then you get to the 19th century, and by the middle of the century, no one's talking about it anymore. It just kind of like goes away. And so, like, what happened to it, and how might like the common uses of it shed light on that question? And so my original dissertation proposal, out of which this article, as well as the book comes, was that I was going to sit down and I was going to use our new digital archives, particularly the 18th century collections online, which is this new, at the time, was this new archive that had been published by Gale. And I was going to, do a word search, and I was going to find every book that used the word sublime, and I was going to read that part of the book and figure out what they were doing with it. And then I did a rough search, and I realized that by like the 1790s, one third of all books published in England used the word at least once. And so, yeah, I'm not going to sit and read like a third of all of the books published in England for a dissertation. I mean, not incomplete it within, a century or so. And that's when I realized that, wait, the kinds of things I should have said along the way that like one of the reasons I started thinking about this is that I actually have an undergraduate degree in computer science as well as an undergraduate degree in literature. And I sort of at the end of that degree, like put the computer science away and went off to do like German philosophy and then literature, just thinking that, oh, it was just this thing that I did. But I realized that, okay, we had this digital archive. I'm really interested in looking at the language around this particular term over time. What if I used a computational method to like go in, find all the instances of this word, and then collect the words that sort of clustered around it? That could do two things. One, I could see how it's being used outside of these very rarefied contexts, but I could also see like where does it, like when it disappears, where does it go? And so, I mean, that was my first like real quantitative analysis and literary project, one that I've been working on for entirely too long now. Um, and and that led me to like the first really surprising result that I found, which was um, there are a number of different discourses of the sublime that emerge in the 18th century. That is, people are talking about it in terms of rhetoric, but they're also talking about it in terms of theology. And they're also talking about it in terms of poetics, but they're also talking about it in these weirdly practical, like critical terms. Um, and then as you move forward in time, the word itself disappears. Like people do stop using the word sublime, but the clusters of language that form around it don't disappear. They stay stable. So, like, the Sublime has done this really important work of creating a discourse, and I would argue this kind of discourse of criticism, and then it goes away. But that discourse stays and remains. It's just that the sort of central term has gone underground and become invisible. And so that was really the first big kind of quantitative finding that I came to. And in some ways, it's informed most of the work that I've done otherwise, because it showed like what we can do with this kind of hybrid combination of criticism, like recognizing here's this important word and here's why it's important. But here's this really, really complicated thing that we can track numerically and computationally at this really, really big time scale and across all of these different books.
That is really interesting. And it's almost like the word kind of did the work to kind of build a discourse. And then once that discourse was built, it was able to kind of drop out because the discourse already existed. That's really
Yeah,
interesting. Wow.
exactly.
Amazing. Well, firstly, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else listening did too. I do have one more question for you today, which is, do you have any advice for young scholars who might be interested in 18th and 19th century literature or the history of aesthetic theory or methods of quantitative analysis and digital humanities? Anyone who's interested in any of these topics, is there anything they can do to learn more, to kind of strengthen their skills in any of these, or honestly just any general advice you have for anyone who has kind of similar interests to your own?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly, I've been thinking a lot about the question of computation and humanities for obvious reasons, but I've been thinking it a lot pedagogically, right? So I'm in the process here at Stanford of building a new degree program that's combining data science and the humanities and arts into a single BA that will let students come and like learn these methods, sure, but also learn how to apply them to the humanities. And I would say the advice I would have for students that are interested is one, look for this because it's everywhere now, right? Like this is the discourse, the new discourse of technology and a lot of science recently, right? It's this merger between these kinds of critical humanities leaning questions that like give meaning to what we're doing and these kinds of complicated computational approaches. And so I would say, be curious, um, think broadly about the topics that you're interested in, and look for these places where all sorts of things are springing up. And for people who are interested in that, but also interested in aesthetics, who are interested in the 18th century, I would say the same kind of thing I said at the very start, right? Like this is a place to follow your passion. When something appeals to you, when you're like, and you read a book, maybe it's a novel, maybe it's a poem, maybe it's whatever, and you're like, oh, I really like this. This really resonates with me. The first question you should ask is why? What about it really resonates? Is it the way it's written? Is it the kinds of things it said? Is it the venue it appears in? And that can be your key into a broader understanding of well, aesthetics, but also of this field in general.
Thank you so much. These are great pieces of advice. Everyone should go listen to them. And also, everyone should read your new book when it's out, on the Sublime, if I'm not mistaken. Can you give us
Yep.
the title?
It will be called Acts of Aesthetics. Or sorry, no, it will not be. That's the title of the article. I am so sorry. It will be called The Afterlife of Aesthetics.
The Afterlife of Aesthetics. And is there a release date that we can kind of expect it to be out?
Not quite yet. Hopefully we'll have that very soon.
Hopefully soon. Everyone should look out for it. And thank you again so much for joining me today. I have learned a lot myself, and I really appreciate you giving these kinds of backgrounds on all of these topics. So thank you again. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and weekend.
Oh, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. This was a fascinating conversation, and I really enjoyed talking about and sharing all of this. And yes, I hope you have a lovely day as well.